Hello, it's me, Emma here. Welcome back to the channel, and today we are talking about snakes. So I thought this would be a good one to do for February with the Chinese New Year and it being the year of the snake. So they're quite a common kind of phobia, and they're a commonly misunderstood creature, but culturally they have had quite an impact on human society, from the Garden of Eden to Cleopatra. Snakes are often thought of as kind of evil and dangerous, but other people love them and they are quite a common exotic pet. So just a warning, if you do have ophidiophobia, if you're afraid of snakes, these articles and videos do contain photographs of snakes occasionally, so if you're not comfortable with that, then feel free to skip. It's not going to be I'm not going to be offended. I like snakes, but I understand there's lots of people that don't, so don't worry about it. But there will be some anatomical diagrams and things. Nothing. These are drawn diagrams rather than anything that might be, again, a bit uncomfortable for people that aren't used to dealing with that kind of stuff. But I think they're very interesting animals, and their anatomy, their physiology, and the way they function, they're quite unique, and I think it's really, really interesting. So we're going to look at the anatomy and physiology of snakes, some of their unique features, some of their unique abilities. We're going to look at some of the dangers of snakes and some of the kind of deadly ones. And then by the end of the month, we'll have a chat about the cultural impact that snakes have had and some of the important sort of religious and cultural stories around snakes and some of the things there, because I think it's really quite interesting. Some kind of basic facts about snakes. So snakes are limbless reptiles with long thin bodies, so they don't have legs at all. They are generally quite long. Some of them are thicker, some of them are skinnier, and they're covered in some thick scales that kind of protect them and allow them to grip and to move. So you can see this is a rainbow boa with some, they have a beautiful kind of iridescent coloration to their scales, but you can see the interlocking scales there that give protection but also allow them to grip so that they can move along the ground and climb trees and things. Snakes don't have eyelids, so that's one way to tell the difference between a snake and a lizard that has no legs, because there are a few of them, like the slow worm, that generally most lizards have eyelids. Not all of them do, but most of them do. But snakes never have eyelids, so what they have instead is they've got a clear scale that covers the eye that's known as the spectacle. They are carnivores, so they either use venom and venomate, so they bite and inject venom into their prey to kill them, or they constrict them by wrapping around them and squeezing them before swallowing their prey whole, so they can open their mouths extremely wide, and we'll get into a bit about how they manage to do that later on. But they swallow their prey whole and then digest it slowly over a period of time. Most snakes lay eggs, but there are a few that deliver live young, and that's something that we'll get into later on as well, the reproduction, because it's quite interesting. And the other thing is that they're ectothermic, which is the more kind of scientific term for an animal that's cold-blooded. What that means is that they use the environment and their behaviour to control their body temperature instead of generating heat internally by burning energy like we do. They go and like sit in the sun or something like that in order to kind of manage their body temperature for various things. So here is a basic rundown of snakes' anatomy. So they do have pretty much all the organs that you would expect them to have, but they're long and thin, and so their positioning is a bit odd. So this picture that I got has a list of where all the organs are. So we've got the esophagus here. I do use the British spellings for these things, so the American spelling drops that were at the beginning, but I use the British English spelling for these things. So we've got the esophagus here in yellow that comes down, and then number 8, which is the stomach, and then progresses to 13, which is the intestines, which lead all the way down to the vent, which is the external opening for the exit of the intestines, the urinary system, and the reproductive system, and it all comes out of one opening, which is known. There's the cloaca, and then the vent, which is the actual external opening part. So that's the main digestive system. That is accompanied by a liver, which is number 7, this brown organ here. So that's the liver, and then the gallbladder, which is not generally directly attached to the liver necessarily in snakes. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. It's a little bit further down because it connects via the bile duct into the intestines. So not that different from mammals in that regard. And then you've got the gallbladder there, and the pancreas is kind of right behind it as well. So again, the pancreas has a duct that connects into the intestines, so that's where that is. And then you've got a spleen, which sits in that same kind of area. So again, not massively different to mammals. The spleen tends to sit near the stomach, but the gallbladder is often a bit removed from the liver. So that's the entirety of their kind of digestive system, and the prey moves very slowly, so it takes them a few days, sometimes a couple of weeks, to digest their prey, depending on the size of the snake and the size of what they've eaten as well. And you can generally see it progressing through their body as it gets digested. So quite an interesting kind of way of doing it. But the next part is the respiratory system, which is quite interesting. So number 2, we've got the trachea, so the windpipe that follows down. Then there's sometimes a pair of kind of tracheal lungs. So these are just kind of parts of the lung that sit further up than you would expect to act as more space for oxygen exchange and more space for air storage. And then we come down and we've got number 4 here. So this is the rudimentary or vestigial left lung. So effectively snakes only have one fully functioning lung, which is the right lung. The left lung doesn't work for gas exchange, it doesn't work for oxygen exchange, but there is the possibility that it does have some involvement in the immune system and immune response. So it potentially does have a function, just not as a lung, essentially. Unlike number 5, which is the right lung, that extends quite far down as well, so it reaches the stomach. In reptiles, there's no diaphragm, so there's no muscle that separates the chest cavity from the abdominal cavity. Everything's all just in the one cavity, which is technically called the coelom. And they don't have a diaphragm, so they use their intercostal muscles, the muscles between their ribs, to breathe rather than the diaphragm like what we have. And then extending past that is the air sac. So this is a clear, it's marked in pink there, but in reality it should be see-through, and that's where air is stored. So a lot of reptiles can essentially go for quite some time without oxygen, a lot longer than we can. And that's part of the reason, is that they can store air in their air sacs, and then it can be used for oxygen exchange as needed. So quite an interesting kind of part there. Yeah, next part here we've got is number 14. So these are the testicles. So this would be in a male snake. You got a pair of testicles, and again they're separated rather than sitting side by side. They're kind of spread out a little bit. If there was a female snake, then you would have ovaries here, and you would have the oviduct, which is the kind of, it works like a uterus. It's not necessarily the same thing as a uterus, but it is very similar. So you'd have ovaries, and then you would have the oviduct that again would lead down to the vent eventually, and that's where eggs are created, and fertilised eggs are developed until they're ready to be laid. Although some snakes, they hold the eggs until they're ready to hatch and then deliver live young. And there are a few snakes that can deliver live young, and they actually have placentas instead of producing eggs. But we'll get into that in a bit more detail next week. And then finally, the 2 dark red organs here are the kidneys. So they do have a urinary system. There's no bladder though. For the most part, instead of producing urea like mammals do, reptiles produce uric acid, which doesn't dissolve in water, and it's a kind of thick white paste essentially, and that's kind of their urine. So The kidneys, again, they function very similarly to how mammals do. And again, that is all kind of excreted out of the vent. And then, it's not pictured here, but into the tail in a male snake there are two hemipenes, so they do essentially have two penises. And they lie within the tail when they're not being used. Their only function is reproductive, but they're kept inside the tail when they're not being used. And in female snakes there's nothing kind of beyond that, and then the tail is the rest of it there. So that's your kind of basic rundown of the organs. Then the final one is the heart, and that's quite interesting. So the heart's generally in the first kind of third of the length of the snake's body. It's one thing that we learned at vet school was how to find it so that you could listen to it. And snakes have a 3-chambered heart, so they have a single ventricle that pumps into both the pulmonary arteries that go to the lungs and the aorta that goes to the rest of the body, and then there's 2 atria that take the blood returning from the body and the blood returning from the lungs, and then it all feeds into the one singular ventricle. So we have 2 ventricles and 2 atria. Snakes only have the one ventricle that does the job of both, essentially. So again, slight differences in the layout, slight differences in the kind of design of the organs, but on the whole, everything that is needed to function is there. So, and then this is a look at skeleton. So they don't have limbs. They don't even have, most snake species don't even have any indication that they ever had limbs from an evolutionary standpoint. But you've got the skull here, and then the jaw, which is quite a complicated, their jaws are much more complicated than ours are, because it facilitates them opening their mouths really wide to swallow prey, which we'll get on to in the next slide. And then you have vertebrae, so you can have anything from 175 to 400 vertebrae depending on the length of the snake, and each vertebrae, to the point where we get to the tail, every vertebrae has a pair of ribs. So they have ribs all the way down. Again, that's common for most reptiles, and because they don't have a separate chest, an abdomen cavity with a diaphragm, so they have ribs down their entire length, and then there would be muscles in between there. And then you reach the kind of end, so the vent would be round about here, and then the tail continues where there's no ribs present. However, there are a few snake species, ones that are considered older in an evolutionary point of view, that do have vestigial pelvic bones. So vestigial is a term that means something that is kind of left over from evolution but doesn't really do anything anymore. And we know that snakes evolved from creatures that had limbs, and then they basically lost them. So boas and pythons do have little vestigial pelvic bones that would be around here, and that can also translate to them having small claws on either side of the vent externally that you can see. But some of the other species of snake that evolved a bit more recently don't have this at all, and there's no evidence at all that they ever had limbs. So an interesting little kind of evolutionary standpoint. So let's take a look at the snake's skull and jaw. So this picture it's a bit blurry, I'm afraid. I couldn't find a better version of it. But what it has is it highlights the joints and the jaws and the skull of the snake, which allow the snake to open its mouth extremely wide to swallow its prey whole. So they're kind of highlighted. So this one here, A in red, is the joint that's between the mandible and the quadrate bone, which is this bone here. And that's a bone that isn't present in other species. It's something that's kind of unique to snakes, that is like an extra hinge for the joint. So it adds an extra hinge essentially to allow the jaw to open wider, and then that connects to the red joint B, which is between the quadrate and the supratemporal bone at the edge of the skull. So the eye socket's here, and the brain would be housed inside this part of the jaw, and that part of the skull even there. And then red C, so this is a joint that's between the prefrontal and the maxilla, so that's the upper jaw. And these joints are the ones that are really mobile, which really allows the snake to open its mouth very wide. So these are the joints in the jaw and the skull that have the most movement. There are a couple of joints that add a little bit more mobility but don't move quite as much as the red ones, and that's the two green ones. So you've got the joint between the frontal bone and the nasal bone, so frontal bone here and the nasal bone, which opens a little bit and allows them to kind of lift their nose up essentially to open wider. And then joint B down here, which is kind of in the mandible, and that allows the lower jaws to move outward a little bit, and they kind of bow outward to again give more space for opening the mouth. And then the final joint here, which is between the supratemporal and the parietal bone, and this is a joint that is immobile, it doesn't move, with the exception of the Dasypeltis species of snakes, which are the egg-eating snakes. So this joint does have mobility in that species, but other than that it doesn't have any movement at all. But all these joints can move quite freely, which really allows the snake, they can move both sides of the mandible independently, and they can really open their mouth surprisingly wide. And it's all thanks to all these joints and this extra bone that isn't present in any other species. And then looking at the teeth on this, so you can see they don't all have big fangs, but they have a number of teeth that all point back towards the throat. And the purpose of that is that it helps them to swallow their prey, and it can't be pulled out, it has to just keep moving back into their mouth and following that. So but some snakes, the venomous snakes, do have specialised teeth often that have a groove in them that allow them to essentially inject poison, inject their venom, kind of like a hypodermic needle would. So it depends, the way the teeth are varies quite a bit depending on the species of snake that we're talking about. The different variations are quite complicated and there's a lot of them, so it's a wee bit beyond the scope of this video, but I'll leave a link to the Wikipedia page, so if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty and all the details, you can read up on it there and learn a bit about all the different things. But there's a lot of different snake species out there, so there is quite a bit of variation between them depending on what they eat and whether they're venomous and all that kind of stuff. So quite an interesting topic, and I'll leave a link in the description so that you can read a bit more about it if you're interested in that. So thanks very much for watching. I hope you found this really interesting. I know snakes can be a little bit scary for some people, but I do find them very, very interesting animals, and I'm looking forward to next week to get into the physiology and some of their special abilities that they have that are quite unusual. So any questions, drop them in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.